Wonderful. Welcome everybody to week 9 of this course, Critical Neuroscience, the Mind-Body Connection. Today we will examine chapter 5, brain, culture, society, those three main aspects, and we will venture into, as the name implies, the connection between brain activity, both in the context of cognition, emotion, and behavior, and social applicability. So we will talk about the context, we will talk about the difference between community and society, we will talk about judgment, we will talk about inclusion, inclusivity, we will certainly talk about diversity, tolerance, and empathy. This is in fact one of the central component of this part of our discussion, and we will begin by examining a concept that in the book is described as mother nature, father nurture. So this is something that will require quite a bit of data analysis, quite a bit of etymological and sociological understanding, because the primary things to discuss is the connection between biology and, I would say, etymology or semantics. So is there anything that we could know with a certain degree of precision that we can borrow from natural sciences, specifically biology, and how does that impact the way we perceive the world in a social context? That will be the very first beginning of this discussion. So let's take a quick tour of history, a quick tour of the way society had interpreted our connection between ourselves, our self-perception, and the world around us. There are multiple ways to do this, and part of our analysis on ethnomedicine, medical anthropology, and the social implication to these fields is because, as we mentioned in past weeks, it is not enough to understand solid biological data to verify how these data actually have an impact in the way we interact on a daily basis with each other. Now, this is also one of those areas of the course where I hope I will provide enough scientific evidence to the way empathy is produced, understood, and shared in order to create a safe environment, in order to create a purposeful, nurturing, and respectful communication level between each other. Now, even if we claim that we are nothing but our brain, as if the brain was not enough, that even in that case, I hope I will be able to display some of the very interesting factors about biology that will shed some light on the often confusing factors that are part of the sociological discourse, especially when that type of analysis clashes with different system of belief. Now, again, mother nature, father nurture. Well, this is a binary labeling mechanism that the books presents, and has to do with some assumption that are part of human history. For instance, think about the connection between matrimony on one side and patrimony on the other side. Matrimony, of course, based on the Indo-European root, Roman root, Latin root, mater or mother, and of course patrimony from the Indo-European root and therefore Roman, Latin, pater. So the connection between male and female, between feminine and masculine, understood from a neurological, biological, and sociological perspective. Now, we will talk about genetics, we will talk about biology as a whole, and of course we will talk about gametes, we will talk about the SRY gene that is very often quoted in any type of research on gender and sex and society and self-perception and orientation and belief system and diversity and inclusion. But we will also make sure to analyze the very connecting tissue, I dare to say, in a figurative sense, of course, between everything we can know and we still do know from hard science based on years and decades, and I dare to say to some extent even centuries of human knowledge, scientific knowledge, and the current application of sociological factors. So this will also mean that we will analyze things such as first, second, and third wave feminism. We will again make a comparison between some modernist, postmodernist, constructivist, deconstructivist philosophies and see how much warranted they are in the context of applying biology to society. We will also ask ourselves, why should we apply biology to society, or vice versa? Why should we apply sociology to bios, vis, to life itself? And is there any discrepancy between perspectives? Can we get a judgment of value understanding through science or from science? In other words, similar to what we said about the mind-body connection, is science enough to understand this very complex topic, or do we have to push a further interpretation, a type of heuristic interpretation, a type of, either to say, apologetic interpretation, where apologetic, I mean that in a theological, philosophical context, or the opposite? Should we assume that everything that is culturally, sociologically based has to be based on solid science in order to verify what the ultimate truth is? Those are all questions that I would like to address this week and next week.
So again, this week, week 9, we talked about brain, culture, and society. And so I would like to begin with the sociological cultural analysis of the application of neuroscientific fact to the discussion. And in the last part of this lecture, I will move on to biology related to the concept of self and the concept of identity. Now, this chapter is quite complex, so I will cover chapter 5 in 2 parts. This week, we will, again, focus on context and situation, part of medical anthropology / ethnomedicine, although I already included some of the external references and videos last week, so I really encourage students to review those if you're interested in these specific aspects. And the third element will be the so-called mother nature, father nurture. And again, I am using this binary metaphoric description of the nature-nurture debate, really, to again specify and defend the connection between social sciences and, so to speak, hard sciences, something that I briefly addressed last week when we make the false comparative dichotomy analysis between STEM fields and liberal studies. We should really focus on not so much a holistic perspective in this context, but simply the sheer realization that the separation is nonsensical and anti-scientific. So using this metaphor between mother and father to present an actual connection between these two. Now, this chapter will continue next week with cultural, cross-cultural, and transcultural psychiatry, transcultural neuroscience, social neuroscience, neuroanthropology, and sociobiology. But for now, I would like to discuss a brief overview of the social aspects of our analysis. And I would like to start by this overview of culture. If you remember, we mentioned the etymological historical connection between culture, as in the general sociological element, agriculture, cult, cultus, and the connection between the identification of self and what lies outside of our self-identification. Now, I would like to mention something connecting self-identifying, orientation, understanding, and even self-expression. Now, for instance, in the context of psychiatry, one of the things that have changed in very recent time is the depathologizing element of homosexual behavior / orientation. Now, keep in mind that the dichotomy between heterosexual and homosexual as terms were also a relatively recent creation by Carl Maria Carmeni, only in 1869. But also understanding how culture plays a role in understanding what is inside the group as opposed to outside the group. If you remember from last week, we mentioned the sacredness of the separation, and I made a neurobiological example and a psychiatric example in temporal lobe epilepsy. So I really value this part of the semester because we are working on inclusion, understanding, tolerance, and empathy for anybody who we might perceive as separated from ourselves. And again, this is in itself connected to the concept of culture, right? So culture as in cultivation, right? As in the Ciceronian from Cicero or Cicero, cultivation of the soul. It's something that we grow, we worship, we inhabit, we are determined by, and we are determining. So again, this nature-nurture concept of habitat and habitus, where habitat has to do with the place we live, and also from a biological standpoint, and habitus has to do with both the clothes we wear and the habit we create. Now, the sense of belonging has also to do with sociological examination, and in the textbook, one of the names that are mentioned is the one by Patricia Hill Collins, so I really encourage a student to review this part, and more specifically, Collins' concept of matrix of domination or matrix of oppression, which in turn is connected to freedom of expression, power, control, inclusion and exclusion, discrimination and incrimination, difference and diversity, oppression and suppression, group and individual, personal and public, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, and race. Now, a very important concept to keep in mind is that when we're taking a sociological, social perspective as opposed to a biological one, we should be very, very careful not to add current viewpoints, perspective, and opinion and throw them backwards in a time where there are completely different sociocultural frameworks. Now, to be specific, since we mentioned these third and fourth waves of feminism, the paradigm according to which Hill Collins describes this matrix of oppression was the understanding of the African American women's perspective deeply embedded in Black feminist analysis, and rightfully so. Now, in the context of a more detailed analysis, there is something that we have to be very, very careful in judging here. So one of the statements that I would like to bring to your attention is additive models of oppression are firmly rooted in the either-or dichotomous thinking of Eurocentric masculinist thought. Now, aside from a possible personal bias, which we might understand as the right of the author. The issue here is in itself a misappropriation or even a possible oversimplification, lack of understanding that there is not either a single Europe in the context of Eurocentric view, or even a single male as in masculinist thought. Now, if there is something that can be considered universal, particularly in the context of male-dominated elements, or even male type of thought, male cognitive process, male neurological underpinnings, now we will understand that if we are more prone to include a biological analysis. So if we are able to demonstrate with the help of neuroscience and biology the clear distinction between male and female cognitive processes, now we will have more of a warranted belief in the separation between male versus female thought. Although in itself this does not justify the push toward male versus masculinist or female versus feminist, with the former having a negative connotation and the latter, in this context, having a positive one. And again, this is one of the issues where we have to combine social elements and biological elements, but in doing so, we want to make sure that those separate magisteria are fully understood independently first and then verified in terms of their possible connection, because otherwise adding this, in this example, a European thought as one single framework is, simply put, from a scientific perspective, false. And again, it's false not because it's connected to European thought specifically. It would be false also to overgeneralize any type of African American Black feminist thought as the thought of every single individual who some claim to be part of the group. That would be very oppressive in itself to claim that everybody had to think the exact same thought. It will be an assault not just on the individual and the preservation of self, but also to the individual rights in this context and the right for self-identification and self-expression. Now, the other issue is an issue that is connected to the quote-unquote blame game. In a course in critical neuroscience, the critical component has to be positively and organically and as much as possible objectively directed, because the risk is, in the context of separating human beings into groups, the risk is a further alienation where we are more prone to identify the otherness, the other group, the group of people that either think differently from us or behave in a different way or appear different as oppressors or as the enemy, which in turn creates an added stress. Now, to give an example in this context, the context of alienation and separation from groups, and the problematic issue with this, with the group theory, is what we find in the current studies on mental health disorder. So scientific research has clearly indicated that the very development of disorders such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, but also depression and other mental disorders appears to be linked to the process of alienation and estrangement from the culture of origin of the individuals affected by such disorders. So the higher prevalence of such disorders in, for instance, first-generation Americans or disorder connected to traumatic experiences of immigrants and refugees is in itself an indication of the importance of precisely and carefully understanding what group is and the possible dangers in, again, estranging and pointing the fingers at the otherness, which unfortunately is at the core of identity politics. It's an oversimplification that doesn't fully make sense biologically and neurologically speaking, as we examined multiple times, but has intrinsic danger even from a sociological perspective. Now, to clarify, the danger is not in this separation between groups in itself, because there are certain positive aspects in self-identification with a group, with an ethnicity, a spirituality, a culture, a nation, etc., because those are all extension of the concept of family. The danger is when there is a separation between groups, not to have the chance to work on oneself, and therefore also recognizing problems and mistakes and shortcomings of ourselves by blaming the other as different from ourselves, whether the other is simply a person from a quote-unquote different ethno-cultural background, the person belongs to a different political party, a person has different sets of beliefs. Now, we have to work on connectivity, on communication. And this also provides some positive elements, again, in the context of self-appreciation and self-esteem, because we are able to see the other person, again, in a Levinasian term, as the other from me, but connected to me, as a mirroring imaging of myself. So this is in itself nurturing and empathetic in the broadest context of how to create a better world.
Wonderful. So let's continue. Transcultural medicine, transcultural psychiatry, transcultural neuroscience, transpersonal psychology, all these transitions, all these changes, all this morphing structure and perceptive discussions on science present very, very different suggestions and conclusions in terms of what makes us human. And that's what we're trying to do here, because again, brain, culture, and society are deeply intertwined. Now, I think we already discussed this in depth. We discussed in depth the dualism versus monism perspective, and whether anything can be reduced, as in materialist reductionism, or reductive materialism, of course, to basic premises on the basis of pure matter. Now, what does that mean? Well, one of the things that you might hear very often, especially when we were talking about our sense of self, is, well, you need to get your science right. Once you get your science right, then everything will follow, for two main reasons. The first one is that there will be less room for pseudo-interpretation, fake news, we hear this all the time, politicized agenda, and so on and so forth. And the second reason is that there is something about science, and by that I mean hard science, empirical science, evidence-based science, that by definition appears very nurturing, very empathetic and inclusive, because it's less up for debate. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from, what background you have, whether you're more or less entitled culturally, financially, in terms of socioeconomic status. Science treats everybody in the same way. Now, of course, that's nothing to do with the way science is understood from the perspective of, let's say, the problem of evil, why certain individuals suffer more than others, or at least appear to us to suffer more than others. This is something that has to do with, of course, specific branches of apologetics in philosophy. But the idea is this: science is less judgmental, that's at least how it appears to be, in comparison to, for instance, specific philosophical, political, religious, cultural, ethnic factors. Now, if this is the case, and of course I would argue that part of science is exactly about those aspects, and I fully embrace the scientific worldview because of these premises. Now, this will not, however, solve the problem of which one would you pick. What do I mean by that? Well, science by definition is not a democratic process. I mention this all the time. So if you're discussing integrative therapies, for instance, complementary alternative medicine, if on this side you have perfect evidence for the validity, efficacy, effectiveness, etc. of a method, and on the opposite side you have the opposite, by definition, the fact that everything about this treatment does not work, you cannot find the middle ground between these two opposites. Their truth might be only on one side. So it's not democratic in a sense. It doesn't really focus on the will or opinion of the majority. Okay. In fact, quite the contrary. Very often it will be based upon the opinion of the minority, a very informed opinion, because again, we want to distinguish opinion from fact. But the judgment, that will be a much better defined term, of a very tiny minority that has to do with expertise in that very field of science. So this is one of the things about science that we have to take into account. It might not feel good in the moment, but rather than changing the science, we should really change the way how we feel about that. Okay? So this goes again. It's again a part of the discussion on which one would you pick. So let's say you have a certain system of belief, whether religious, a-religious, anti-religious, or cultural, ethno-political, etc. And according to this system of belief, you might disagree with this scientific premise. Okay? Let's assume science says A. I'm oversimplifying things here, of course. Science says A, but according to my belief system, this is really B. Okay? Now let's assume that you cannot find a middle ground. There's no middle ground between A and B. Okay, there's no semitonic element. It's not like a vowel like A and E, for instance. Okay, pronounced as A and A. You might find an E, for instance, as an in-between pronunciation. I'll point in the abjad perspective. You have to pick between A and B. No middle ground. No possible gray area there. Which one would you pick? Well, I mentioned this before when we talked about Aquinas and many other philosophers in the Thomistic tradition, scholastic tradition, and so on and so forth. Even before that, the Aristotelian tradition, Socratic tradition. If there is a clash between your belief and the evidence, then you got one or the other wrong. I'm gonna oversimplify things here. let's assume that your disagreement with the scientific evidence is based upon your religious perspective. If your religion, or in other words, the way you interpret your religion disagrees with science, well, either your interpretation of religion is wrong or your interpretation of science is wrong. Okay, you had to make a choice, and in neither case you will find a solution that might appeal to you. Okay, because again, in this sense, only in this specific sense, outside of politics and judgmental extremist view, only in this sense, science does not care about your emotion, does not care about the way you feel about certain things. You might be just wrong. Now, I really want to stress this point because when we talk about transcultural psychiatry, transpersonal psychology, and so on, one of the elements of discussion has to do with the folk component, okay? F-O-L-K, or V-O-L-K in the Germanic counterpart in German, which is this ethnocultural component to the judgment of medicine. For instance, just to give you an example, what appears to be a depressive state in a certain culture might be the norm, the behavioral emotional norm in another culture. And by the same token, something might appear as very manic, for instance, or even hypomanic in one culture might appear just the norm in a different culture. So we have to distinguish perception that are predicated upon either personal or social cultural factors from facts. Now, again, I do understand the difficulties of doing this in the context of neuroscience and psychology, because by definition this field is at the intersection of mind and body. So how can you claim to have a solid fact that's completely removed from your personal interpretation, for your personal interpretation as in cognitive interpretation, emotional interpretation, and behavioral interpretation? It's very, very difficult. Nevertheless, we could start by identifying some of the overall standards in science to determine what we mean by self. Okay? So let's begin with the construct first. Now, this might be somewhat easy because it's to some extent a review. So when we think about self, we think about this reflection, this reintegration, reforming, reconstructing conceptualization of identity. And of course, with identity, we mean a tautological semantic sequence according to which I am the same as myself. I identify myself as myself. And this, of course, from a neurological perspective, has to do with everything we already mentioned about memory, cognition, time and space, and the fact that I'm able to recognize myself as an individual, as I verify my essence against the essence of others. Okay, so think about as a container and the contained factor. Okay, I do understand where my boundaries stop in the presence of something external. Okay, and this is very, very interesting. We mentioned this before in the context of modulation of behavior, where some individuals might struggle more or less in the presence of others, and this can be predicated upon neurological factors and also the sense of belonging and yet separating oneself. Okay, so if you belong too much to the environment, to your community, to your family, to your society, to your culture, then you melt in this culture, and your self-perception as an individual disappears, because again, you're part of the whole. However, if the opposite is true, where you don't have any connection whatsoever with the world out there, then this might actually create another type of stressor to you, because you feel there is no connection whatsoever. You exist in a vacuum. You are all alone. Okay, in this sense, you are solus, we would say in Latin. You're both alone and lonely. Okay, you're completely separated. And if you're separated, of course, in the context of mental health disorder, this is a recipe for disaster. You're separated, you're annihilated, you are destroyed, you are dissociated, disintegrated. All your parts will disattach from one another. So this is also to do with self. The other thing is that self has to do with this mirroring component. We mentioned already the research by Rizzolatti et al. In the context of promoting empathy by virtue of interacting with others, with the other human being, or from a philosophical perspective, the research by Emmanuel Levinas, for instance, and this otherness. I understand myself through the eyes of the other person, through the body, through the perception of the other person, and therefore the more connection, the better, okay? The more appropriate balance between these poles, the better. And so you could view this conceptualization of self as a battery, okay? Two poles, positive and negative. You need to find the proper distance between your conceptualization of self and the external world, despite the fact that you are indeed the world. You are nature too, and that's connected to what we said about ethnomedicine and medical anthropology. Nature as a term, as I mentioned multiple times, has to do with this ever-growing, ever-reborn factor, natura naturans, we would say in Latin, ever being born again, okay? And this has to do with self. Now, one of the main issues that very often we discuss in neuroscience is, what does our brain tell us about ourselves? And in this context, we already mentioned that you can pick different directions, the cognitive aspect, the memory aspect, the selective attention aspect, and the emotions and the pain aspect, all of this, and for which I recommend you review the lecture on neuroanatomy and physiology. But what does our brain tell us about the labels that we use for ourselves? For instance, in the context of identity, orientation, and preference, okay, and behavior, I would say, does our brain say anything about who we are in terms of gender versus sex, okay? And this is something that it's quite important to understand, to again promote empathy, to promote inclusion, to promote further understanding. Now the question remains, however, let's assume that there are only two ways to interpret the world. One view will be, well, gender is a social construct and is a spectrum, okay? It is a non-binary spectrum, okay? I'm kind of putting things together here to understand. It's an over simplistic view of this perspective. And the other is quite the opposite. Gender is by definition binary. It's entirely based on a sequence of two opposites, so it's not on a spectrum, and there is no intrinsic variation, okay? There might be differences in statistical outliers, but it's nevertheless binary, one versus the other, male versus female, okay? So let's assume there are these two perspectives. What if, again, we're still in the hypothetical realm here, there is a clash between what you thought about science and what you thought about, let's say, your philosophical perspective, okay? Or religious, or spiritual, or whatever you want to name, okay? One is it's what you thought of solid evidence-based science, and the other thing, what you thought about your own interpretation of this philosophy, okay? So let's assume that you are able to study everything in a very, very detailed way. The question still remains, you have to pick one, okay? So assuming that the evidence is really against your system of belief, the scientific evidence goes against, for sake of this argument, your religious perspective. Science, in other words, goes against what you believe as a religious person, okay, about this issue, gender and sex. Again, what my suggestion will be in this sense, without oversimplifying the importance of keeping validity in all these areas, okay, without pushing too far the notion that all that matters is matter again. Although I would certainly embrace that perspective because of everything we said about science earlier, this factual-based investigation. What if there's a discrepancy between these two? Well, again, you might make a mistake. You either misinterpret science or you might misinterpret religion in the sense. Now, I do understand that this is a very, very complex topic and something that cannot be fully discussed in a 15-week course on critical neuroscience. But again, since we're talking about mind and body, we cannot really forget about the third elephant in the room, if you remember what we said about the dualism versus monism perspective. So you have mind and body, where body means hard sciences, of course, the evidence you have in front of you, the fact. Mind might mean your psychological processes as well as your opinion. The third things, of course, cannot be, you can argue, cannot be directly experienced beside mystical experiences, of course, but can perhaps either be studied or learned through, for instance, theological examinations and apologetics, etc. So that probably that of course might sound dogmatic to some extent. Okay, so let's assume that the quote-unquote dogma of your religion disagrees with the facts of science. Again, you have to pick. Either you misinterpret the quote-unquote dogma, you misinterpret the rules of religion, or you misinterpret the science. Now, what we're trying to do here is to see whether there could be actually an overlapping element between these really three perspectives: mind, body, and the third element. Okay, we will talk about the triple S model in the next few weeks, and we will see why this is important. So the assumption is that there was a clash, okay, that at least matter and mind do not match. Oversimplifying, science and belief do not match. But what if they did? What if the issue is more about our personal interpretation and doesn't have to really destroy the notions, rules, regulations, and evidence from both perspectives? Now, of course, this will hit us hard because it's hard to let go of preconceived notion. There's plenty of scientific evidence in psychological science about that it's easy to go back in time and say, well, I always agree with this if you're proven wrong, rather than say that, yes, I was wrong, my interpretation was wrong, this is actually the truth. Okay, it's really hard to let go of this. But again, what if this clash is only apparent? What if in the end there could be a connection between all of the above? Mind, body, and I dare to say spirit in this sense from a theological perspective, on this very issue, the issue of identity, the issue of self, the issue of understanding who we are from the mind-body perspective, as well as the issue of gender and sex and society and culture. What if that would be the case? So I will leave that as a question, and I'd like to venture for now with a very basic analysis of what we just discussed. So gender and sex. Now, rather than starting off with a sociological discussion, I would like to start from biology. And there are plenty of ways to discuss this, but a good way to understand would be, okay, does our brain say anything about sex and gender? In other words, are there specific valid, scientifically valid parameters that help us distinguish either between a binary structure of gender and sex, as opposed to gender versus sex, or is a spectrum the best representation of what the brain is? And beyond that, is there anything else in biology, the body as a whole, not just the brain, that could help us understand how we can verify a person's gender or sex, okay, before we venture into the identity concept? Well, let's leave the brain aside for now, although the brain always plays the central role in the way everything comes together, and I admit my bias in this sense, but you know, if you think about thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland, it's really hard not to see the brain as one of the main contributors, at least, to the way the body works. But if the question is, okay, please quickly define gender and sex etymologically speaking, and then see what are the biological scientific parameters to understand that. Let's try to do this in this lecture. So etymologically speaking, we mentioned gender is connected to an Indo-European root that has to do with creation, creative power, generativity, right? Gender, genus, genos, okay, so the Latin Greek component is generativity, this production, and of course in this sense is very much a poetic term, okay? Poetic from poiein, again, creation in Greek. It's a wonderful term, and of course has also a connection with sex in itself. because it has to do with creativity generation, therefore sexual creativity in this sense, okay? Creation on a biological sense. Sex, it's also an Indo-European term, of course, and it's very, very similar in the way multiple Indo-European languages developed. So sesso, sexum, sex, and so on and so forth, has to do with the Indo-European roots that is connected to cutting, to separating, again, in a binary sense, to separate the male from the female, at least etymologically speaking, okay? Now, this is one of the things about languages. Languages, by definition, evolve, and the question might remain: so how straightforward should we be in accepting either the primary way a word has been used in time past, and how much leeway, how much freedom of interpretation should we have about the way the word is utilized nowadays, okay? With biology, it's somewhat easier because it's directly observable, and what was true, I don't know, 100,000 years ago, it's still true nowadays, okay? With words interpretation, things, of course, are also predicated upon a sociocultural influence. So if the question is how does biology understand sex? Are there different methods that biology utilizes to understand and verify what sex a person is? Well, one of the prime methods is, of course, using chromosomes, and we will talk about each of these methods in a little bit. But of course, the XX, XY method with the SRY gene is the primary way to interpret sex according to the chromosomes. And the second method will be examining gonads, of course, also within biology. A third method will have to do with the level of hormones, and because hormones and neurotransmitters, as we mentioned multiple times, are deeply connected. Think about what we said in regard to the endocrine nervous system. These two will have to do with the brain. And then, of course, because we're talking about identification of sex, the last one will be genitalia, of course, so external reproductive factors. Now, I only mentioned these four because they are the most commonly utilized in the context of a critical understanding of the conceptualization of self. But then there is another fully separated and, of course, yet interacting element on the brain level alone. And this will be the area of understanding how the brain is wired, for instance, front to back as opposed to contralateral, so right-left hemisphere, whether the brain has more or less activation in these or that specific areas, and whether this variability can be accounted for on either binary or non-binary components, whether there's more or less between female and male subject, and other neural correlates that are evidence-based that justify differences, for instance, in emotional response and behavior and cognition. So this is just a general overview. But let's try to dig a little deeper into the biology of sex and gender. All right, so as we mentioned, let's start first by talking about chromosomes. Chromosomes as the first method to understand sex.
Wonderful. So as usual, I would like to start by the definition with some etymological analysis. The word chromosomes was first utilized by the German anatomist Heinrich Wilhelm Waldeyer and comes from the Greek. Soma, if you remember, has to do with body, right? We mentioned that in the somatic nervous system. And the Greek chroma means color. And so color plus body, the word chromosome describes their strong staining by particular dyes. Now, why are chromosomes related to sex determination in human beings? Well, let's start from sex determination in mammals. In placental mammals, the presence of a Y chromosome determines sex. In general, cells from female contains two X chromosomes, and cells from male subjects contain an X and a Y chromosome. So again, XX or XY. Now, in human embryos, something that I would like you to remember, the SRY gene encodes a very specific and unique transcription factor which is activating a testis-forming pathway around 7 weeks of development. Now, before this time, the embryonic gonad is, so to speak, indifferent. It's not specialized, meaning that it's capable of developing to either a testis or an ovary. Now, once this gene product stimulates the indifferent gonad to develop into a testis, the SRY gene, the testis begins producing two hormones, testosterone and anti-Mullerian hormone, or AMH. Should also specify that in the early stage, the early embryo has two different system of ducts, the Wolffian and Mullerian duct. And they're both capable of developing to the male and female reproductive tracts, respectively. Now, dihydrotestosterone, which is one of the derivatives of testosterone, induces formation of other organs in the male reproductive system, while AMH, again the anti-Mullerian hormone, causes the degeneration of the Mullerian duct. Now, in female subjects who do not contain SRY protein, this ovary-forming pathway is activated by a different set of proteins. The fully developed ovary then produces estrogen, which triggers development of the uterus, oviducts, and the cervix from the Mullerian duct.
Wonderful. The second one that I would like to discuss are hormones. Okay, again, hormones in connection to neurotransmitters. How do they play a role in understanding sex?
Now, to continue with mammals, the two main sex hormones are estrogen and testosterone. And these sex hormones have a wide-ranging effects in the body. As we mentioned earlier, the estrogen is produced primarily by the ovaries, while testosterone is produced by testes. Now, keep in mind that these hormones affect sexual function as well as a variety of processes, physiologically speaking, so from brain, blood vessel, bones, etc. Now, since everything is connected, and we will talk about gonads next, keep in mind that sex hormones are also known as gonadal steroids, gonadocorticoids, or simply sex steroids, because they're steroid hormones that interact with the vertebrate steroid hormone receptors. Now, while it's true that by definition, male sex hormones are androgens and female sex hormones are estrogens and progestogens, you also need to keep in mind that there are other types of sex hormones. So within progestogens, pregnenolone, progesterone, allopregnanolone, etc. Within androgens, androstenedione, dihydropinestrelone, androstenedione. Within estrogen, estrone, estradiol, estriol, and a few others. Now, of course, progestogens, or progestagens, spelled with the A, are in themselves a class of steroid hormones that bind to and activate the progesterone receptor. And progesterone is the major and most important progestogen in the body. Now, this is so important, just to specify the link again between the meaning of the word, etymology, and the biological structure. Progestogens are named for their function in maintaining pregnancy. So the word progestational, although to be specific, there are also present other phases of the menstrual cycles and the estrus. Now, while they're involved in pregnancy primarily, the major tissues affected by progestogens include also brain activity, brain specifically, but also the uterus, the cervix, breast, testes, vagina. And the main biological role of progestogens is the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system. And therefore, they're involved in preparation of the mammary gland for lactation, regulation of the menstrual cycle, breastfeeding, following parturition in women. And in men, progesterone affects spermiogenesis, sperm capacitations, and testosterone synthesis.
Fantastic. So let's continue with gonads as a third method. This is not a specific order, it's just an order that I like to utilize in this lecture. Gonads to understand sex, and also whether this distinction and understanding between sexes are only applicable to human beings or to other mammals, other animals, or maybe something else that we will discuss in the next few minutes.
Now, talking about the animal kingdom in zoology, gonad indicates as a word the primary reproductive gland that produces reproductive cells, also called gametes. Now, talking about etymology again, well, gamete originates from the Greek word gamete, wife, or gametes, husband, from gamos, marriage. Gonad and gender originate from the Greek gone, which indicates generation, seed, and in itself, borrowing from modern Latin gonades, which is the plural of gonad. So again, from gonas through gonas, genus, 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 and in Latin, genus or genus is, of course, indicating not just seed, but also birth, creation, family, and even in an extended sense, nation. So gonas, genus, genus, gender. So by this definition, it also indicates a type or a class of noun, for instance, in the case of grammar gender. And this indication of separation, of distinction, is also present in the etymological origin of the term sex, from also separating, dividing, cutting through from the Indo-European root. So again, but what do they do, since they're primary reproductive organs? So gonads are responsible for producing the sperm and ova, but they also secrete hormones and are considered to be endocrine glands. So again, the connection between nervous system and endocrine system, between hormones and neurotransmitter. Just to review within testes. So male sex hormones as a group are called androgens, and the principal androgen is testosterone, which is secreted by the testes. Versus thinking about ovaries, two groups of female sex hormones are produced in the ovaries, the estrogens and progesterone, and the steroid hormones contribute to the development and function of female reproductive organs and sex characteristics.
Moving on, let's talk about genitalia as our investigation on sex and gender continues.
So to continue our examination, genitalia are sex organs or reproductive organs. They're any part of an animal or plant that is involved in sexual reproduction. In animals are testes in the male and ovary in the females, and of course they're called primary sex organs. Secondary sex organs, divided between the external sex organs, the genitals or genitalia, are visible at birth in both sexes, and on the other side you have internal sex organs. So again, to review everything and bring it all together, the primary sex organs are the gonads, which is a pair of sex organs that diverge into testes following male development or into ovaries following female developments. But the gonads, as primary sex organs, generate reproductive gametes containing inheritable DNA. And gamete, of course, to continue our etymology from gonos, is a term that originates from the ancient Greek, that also is connected to marry. And a gamete is a haploid cell that fuses with another haploid cell during fertilization in organisms that reproduce sexually. Now, size, specific biological size, it's also important in our discussion because male bodies develop toward the production of small gametes, so sperm, and female bodies develop toward the production of large gametes, or ova.
Fantastic. Last but certainly not least, we will talk about the brain as a whole. This is a course in critical neuroscience, so of course I would like to pay special attention to this topic.
The first thing I want to mention is that, yes, science has indeed identified very specific differences between male and female brain in this context. But again, I want to be clear, this does not mean that those differences are differences in capacities or abilities, but we could identify those differences as variations of already present functional and structural components of the brain that might justify, biologically speaking, differences in preferences, for instance, in the context of social interaction, job choice, emotional response. And of course, this has a very important practical application in the context of clinical diagnosis and medicine. So it's really, really important to understand that there is no such thing as anti-scientific component in verifying the existence of these factors. In practice, we already identify basic biological sex differences between male and females, including size, gene expression, differences in chromosomes, hormone productions, morphology of genitals, external factors such as weight and height and voice pitch and bone density and muscle mass. But similar differences are also found in the context of neural functions and structures. For instance, there are significant neuroanatomical differences that are largely due to the effect of sex hormones on brain development. And this, of course, indicates that the activity, the expression of genes on the sex chromosomes play a role in shaping such differences. On average, to give an example, males and females showed greater volume in different areas of the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. Females had greater volume in the prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, superior temporal cortex, and lateral parietal cortex, as well as the insula. Males instead had greater volume in the ventral temporal and occipital region, which might also account for better visual spatial performance data that we obtain from psychological testing. Now, of course, within functional brain imaging research and brain neuroimaging studies in general, it is clear that there are anatomical differences that are connected with rotation, visual object recognition, face processing, inhibition, and cognitive control, as well as conflict. The strongest association was found in facial processing. Another important element is that, on average, scientists identify that females tend to have a significantly thicker cortices than men, while men had higher brain volume than women in subcortical region. And this is important because, in general, based on studies published so far, thicker cortices are associated with higher scores on general intelligence tests and cognitive tests. Again, we could provide many other examples of sexual dimorphism between males and females. For instance, the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus is significantly larger in males, or the fact that in terms of connectivity tissue, male subjects appear to have a stronger link front to back in comparison to hemilateral connectivity, so between right and left hemisphere in female subjects. Again, beyond issues of white matter connectivity, it is important to understand that there are sex-specific differences that could better explain differences between male and female rates within mental health needs. For instance, women are twice as likely to experience clinical depression and anxiety as men, despite the fact that the rates for self-harm and suicide rates are very, very different, in fact opposite, where men are about 3 times as likely to suffer from autism and twice as likely to have ADHD in comparison to women. Same thing we could say about developmental aspect of mental health, where young males' dyslexia rates perhaps 10 times that of girls, and they are 40% more likely to develop schizophrenia in adulthood.
Thank you very much. This concludes Week 9, Brain, Culture, and Society, Chapter 5. We will continue with the same chapter next week because, as I mentioned, this is a relatively small chapter in terms of the very pages that are dedicated to it, but the discussion is a quite complex one, so we will continue again in Week 10 with Transcultural Psychiatry, Social Neuroscience, and many other fascinating topics. Thank you very much. See you all next week.